American beautyberry is also known as Calocarpa americana. It is a relatively important wildlife species in the U.S. Um, you typically identification of this plant is based on opposite leaves and mild serration. There's also the texture of these leaves. They are very velvety and thin. They are actually more translucent than the majority of leaves you will see. When crushed, they are aromatic. Some people say they smell like Fruit Loops. I don't know how I am about that. But the stems are pubescent, the leaves are pubescent, and it produces a bright purple berry in the fall. This berry is where the majority of its wildlife value comes from, because that berry it is on the plant long enough that it feeds birds coming in and migrating, and this is such a widespread food source that over 40 species of birds in the south actually eat beautyberry. So it's quite in demand, and there's quite a lot of use made of it. That's American beautyberry. Sorry, it's wilted. So this here is broom sedge. It is Andropogon virginicus. It is a native plant. It is a perennial, and it's got the coloration with the purplish red and the green that you do normally see with a lot of blue stems. But unlike a lot of the blue stems, it does not have a round base of the plant. It's in fact very much flattened. Another thing specific to broom sedge is that the inside of the leaves, and I don't know if you can see it, are covered with this pubescence, and it's rather sticky. They are very important for structure during the winter because they'll die, and then it will still persist, and then this will provide a lot of cover for bird and small mammal species, especially bobwhite quail. And some birds will eat the seeds, but not really all that many of them. It is a clump grass, and it is a native warm season grass. The next plant that I have is Kogon grass. That's Imperata cylindrical. It is incredibly invasive, a non-native plant, and it has, oh my goodness, it takes over absolutely everything. It forms mats incredibly quickly, to the point where it becomes a monoculture. It will go and crowd out every other species that it possibly can. We brought it in for cattle forage. That didn't work too well. So now it's taking over the entire United States. That's great. Anyway, you can tell that it's Kogon grass specifically because of the offset midrib. That is a really good indicator for Kogon grass. It does actually spread both by seed and by rhizomes, so when you go and try to kill it with herbicides, you have to go and do it again the next year in order to control it. It will actually make its own environment as likely to have a fire as possible because it's set up to burn so incredibly hot so that it does that. But yeah, it has no wildlife value. It's kind of useless, but yeah. That offset midvein is pretty much exactly what you're looking for with Kogon grass. That and a little bit curly. So this is common ragweed, or Ambrosia artemisifolia, I believe. It is actually an incredibly important wildlife plant, unlike giant ragweed, which is also in the Ambrosia genus. Common ragweed is a native plant, and it has these opposite, rather dissected leaves, but they're rounded at the ends, unlike Spanish needles. And it kind of looks like a fern. Ragweed is actually responsible for about 90% of the allergies in the United States, although we blame goldenrod for a great deal of that. But it's relatively easily identifiable. It's a native plant, and it actually produces a whole lot of seed that is incredibly important and nutritious for things like quail and our birds. It is a disturbance species, and It actually has about 30% crude protein, so that makes it very important for deer in the summer. And it's about, I believe, 80% digestible, so it's a pretty cool plant, incredibly high wildlife value. Common ragweed. So this is Dallas grass, and I am actually taking this video. So it is Paspalum dilatatum, I think, or dilatatum. It is an invasive species that was introduced here for cattle grazing previously. It is relatively identifiable primarily by its seed heads. It usually has, I think, between 4 and 7 of these, but they are green with little bitty black dots on them. And then this, unlike Vasey's grass, which it might be mistaken for without the seed head, it does not have a very prominent midrib at all. And the ligule on this is entire. So that's how you identify Dallas grass. There may also be some reddish coloration on the stem that can be seen, but typically it ends up forming sods, and that isn't good for structure at all, so it has very low wildlife value overall. It does end up outcompeting the natives. So my next plant is Dicanthelium. It's Dicanthelium species. I don't know the particular one, but these are actually pretty easy to ID if you've got the seed head on them. And they actually have this kind of, I guess it's been called exploding Christmas tree head. It's not particularly dense. If there's a very dense thing that looks like this, it's not the same thing. It's not Dicanthelium. But Dicanthelium also has leaves that come directly out of the stem. You can see that. It's usually a little bit smaller than other things. And Dicanthelium has a great deal of wildlife use. It produces an incredible amount of seed that is used by birds throughout its ripe season. And then the basal rosettes are actually incredibly important during the winter, because this thing will die back its perennial to that basal rosette, and that basal rosette is full of calcium. So turkeys and deer and all kinds of things like that, rabbits, will rely on that for nutrition during the winter. This is dog fennel. It's dehydrated by now, but it is actually dog fennel. So that's Eupatorium capillifolium, and it is a perennial herbaceous forb. Typically, this has a lot more volume. It's kind of like a bottle brush. It is actually in the Eupatorium family genus, despite not having doubly serrated leaves or even an opposite leaf arrangement. It is absolutely a disturbance species, and it will show up anywhere that there's been fire, anywhere that there's been moved soil. They are actually a native plant, and one clear sign that it's actually dog fennel is to crush this up, and it smells rather strongly, very sour, almost like dill. As for wildlife value, there's not a terrible lot of wildlife value for this thing. It feeds a couple of wasps and also some pollinators, and then it gives a little bit of structure because it's a perennial plant and it dies back, and that dead matter stays together. That gives a little bit of structure to animals in the winter. Yeah, dog fennel. So this is dogwood. The one that we studied was silky dogwood, so Cornus amomum, but I do not think that's the one that was at Knoxview Refuge. I think this is likely either roughleaf or swamp dogwood, so Cornus stricta or Cornus drummondii. Either way, all dogwoods are very similar. They have these opposite leaf arrangements, and what's best referred to as arcuate venation. So all of the veins, maybe you can see on the back of the leaf, are parallel to each other, but they curve around following the margin of the leaf. Another cool thing about these is that if you take them and you're very gentle, you can pull them apart and see the fibers, and that's a pretty good sign that you're dealing with dogwood. Dogwoods, they have some wildlife use. They do produce berries, or soft mass at least, and that is eaten by some wildlife. Yeah, can also be used to help stabilize slopes and wetlands, and I would think that would go doubly so for those which are better adapted to wetlands. Also, their new growth hoards calcium, so it's very good for browsing. This is goosegrass, or Eleusine indica. It is a non-native species of grass, and it has been considered to be naturalized. Goosegrass has this flat base of the stem, and the leaves actually are also flattened rather, which is rather similar to one of the blue stems we just covered, but unlike the blue stems, it has an entirely different shape. It is rather round comparatively, but most notably, the seed head on goosegrass actually has these spikelets that look a little bit like a cross between Dallas grass and gamma grass, but they have 2 to 8 of these little thingies. They don't actually have that high of wildlife value, unfortunately. Even though it is naturalized, it's considered a pest species because only a few things will actually eat the foliage from these plants. Yep. That's goosegrass. Hi, this is greasy grass, or Trident strictus. Typically it does not show up this early, but I was fortunate enough to find some. Its most identifiable feature is this seed head that looks kind of like a rod. It's unfortunately a little bit tatty currently, but if you can't get the seed head, then the leaves themselves are very tightly curled around the stem. As you can see here, and these leaves feel very, very rough. They are a wetlands plant typically, and waterfowl love them. They are a native warm season, I believe, clump grass, so they provide a lot of structure, and they also, with these seeds, provide a great deal of food for waterfowl and other things that live in the wetlands. The reason it's called greasy grass is that this seed head in the fall, if you feel it, it actually feels rather greasy. I think that's kind of neat. It is a perennial, and the seeds that it makes are actually very high in nutrition. Green ash is Fraxinus pennsylvanica. Ashes are most easily recognized by their opposite pinnately compound leaves, as opposed to hickories that have alternate pinnately compound leaves. Green ash is typically found in wet sites, and it may have slightly different coloration than does white ash, and most notably you'll see purple along the nodes on green ash. That makes it very easy to spot. But green ash, it is actually a dioecious species, I believe, and it produces samaras rather than any sort of berry. So it is not typically fed upon by animal species, and therefore it doesn't have that great a wildlife value. If you want to differentiate green ash from white ash, typically you're going to look at the bud scars. You'll have half-moon-shaped bud scars on the green ash, and then the bud will sit on top of that. But yes, a few birds will eat some of the seeds, but it is not a primary source of nutrition for anything. So, this is Indian heliotrope. It is not actually a native plant, Heliotropium indicum. It is a naturalized plant, surprisingly enough. It is perennial. It's actually not a vine, I don't believe, but it's very much a wetlands plant. And the way that you tell the difference between this and hemp vine is that hemp vine has opposite leaves, while Indian heliotrope has alternate leaves. They are wrinkled, they're quite fuzzy, but probably the most noticeable thing about Indian heliotrope is this flower. The flower that looks like that. It is a poisonous plant, but yeah. It is and has actually been used to treat various medical conditions like inflammation, tumors, and warts, so I would assume what you're doing with that is burning stuff off. Anyway, Indian heliotrope, quite an interesting plant. Okay, so this is Japan grass, Microstagium vimineum, I think. It is an invasive plant introduced to the U.S. through packing. When people were shipping stuff to us, they shipped it with this. So that was lovely. It mostly takes over near waterways, and typically this is what it's going to look like. The most characteristic things are these sets of two opposite leaves, pointed, relatively thin, and then there's always a long set of two leaves at the top of the stem. So this really does not have much wildlife use. It may do something for cover, but the fact is that it forms such dense mats that it outcompetes all other vegetation and does not serve as a good cover plant, unfortunately. Yeah. This here is Johnson grass, Sorghum halpense, or halpense. It was introduced to feed cattle long ago, and it is now an invasive species in the U.S. It is actually toxic during the drought. So you identify this primarily by this very prominent white midrib. There's another plant that has that. It would be silver plume grass, but silver plume grass has pubescence here that it does not have. Johnson grass only has this one little white tuft on the ligule right here. That's a pretty dead giveaway that this is Johnson grass. It does get an exploding seed head very similar to Dicanthelium or to purple top, but it does not droop as much as purple top, and that's the rest of the plant is very clearly Johnson grass. There's not all that much wildlife use, possibly cover, because even though it is a clumping grass, it forms more of these mats that don't provide all that much space, unfortunately, for everything to live there. Yeah, that's the issue. And then this can reproduce by a rhizome, which makes it rather hard to kill. My next plant is muscadine grape, so that's Vitis rotundifolia. It is a native species, it is a woody vine, and it's often mistaken for other species of grapes that are native to the south, but unlike, say, summer grape, it has a very glabrous surface, and there's no fuzziness, no pubescence on the stems, which are also not red. These leaves are also typically a little bit smaller and less lobed than, say, summer grape may be. They're relatively important for wildlife in that they have fruit that's ripe from August to September, and they are animal dispersed, so they do provide a whole lot of food for things in the fall. And pretty much everything eats them. Birds, mammals, it's insane. Numerous songbirds, actually. And then they are browsed by deer, but that's not particularly important to the deer. It's actually a relatively low browse. However, grapevines and vines in general do actually offer cover for creatures such as squirrels in the trees, because they grow up in the canopy and make for some decent structure. So this is a teeny tiny American pokeweed. It is Phytolacca americana, I believe. Yeah, I found a just small one over there. But this is pretty identifiable. It's got the red stem, which usually happens in maturity, but this one was growing it a little bit earlier. And then it has these alternate leaves with relatively entire margins. They can get kind of untidy looking, but this one hasn't gotten to that point yet. And then it's actually got the same flowers. They're just about ready to bloom that you see in pokeweed, and that's the exact growth habit of the flower. So this is a perennial native plant, I believe, and it actually has a great deal of wildlife use. It is a Power 6 plant, and it is the berries are eaten by lots of birds. It is very much animal dispersed, but deer absolutely love to browse it. So you get these almost purplish black fruit in the fall. Late fall to early winter. And yeah, that's about it. American pokeweed, kind of cool. Oh, sorry, it also has this thing called phytotoxins in it that will poison you. They're toxic to humans and most other things. Sassafras is also known as Sassafras albinum. It is a native plant, actually a tree that has relatively interesting leaf structure, I think. It has the ability to have different amounts of lobing in its leaves. It can have 3 lobes. Let me see if I have 2 lobes. I don't have a better choice than that one. And 1 lobe. And that can all appear on the same plant regardless of maturity. But unfortunately, a lot of other plants can also do that, so it's not actually a defining characteristic. I would say that the shape of those leaves, in addition to that, is pretty characteristic of sassafras itself, but if you're not sure, there's a very specific smell from Sassafras albinum if you crush up the leaves because it's an aromatic plant, and it also has these orangish pink petioles, which are, relatively visible, and similar looking things like giant ragweed do not have those. Sassafras albinum, it looks whorled, but is actually alternate leaf arrangement. There's not much wildlife value besides that for pollinators because it acts as support for, I believe it's the spicebush swallowtail and then the spicebush silk moth. I don't recall if it's a larval plant or pollination plant, but they are very strongly associated with sassafras. And there's sassafras. This is Sericea lesbideza, so Lesbideza cuneate. It is an invasive plant that was brought here in hopes that it was going to act like every other Lesbideza here and fix nitrogen. As this is a legume, it should fix nitrogen, but instead it actually acidifies soil and removes a lot of nitrogen and basically makes everything inhabitable for everything but itself. It's an ecosystem engineer, so to say. Sericea lesbideza, you can identify it not only by the trifoliate leaves, that's very common with all lesbideza, and the lack of stipules on the leaflets, but there are stipules on the leaves. But specifically Sericea lesbideza, the invasive one, it has, I believe, is it white flowers? Maybe. Yes, it is white flowers. Okay, so the invasive has white flowers, the native one has pink or purple flowers. And then Sericea has the venation on these little bitty leaflets that is absolutely parallel and straight, while the venation on the native Lesbideza is net-like. So that gives you some pointers to go and separate them out. But yes, there's no wildlife use for this species. This here is Sprangletop, or Lepticloa species. This one unfortunately does not have its seed head. I did not collect it, but it is indeed Sprangletop. The leaves are wrapped around the base very tightly, and while it is flattened like a lot of blue stems, it has this absolutely absent ligule, is instead replaced with a little tuft of fur, and the reddish coloration is not all that pervasive with Sprangletop. It does grow a seed head very similar to Dicanthelium, but it is in fact denser, so it has a higher wildlife value because it can provide more seed to the waterfowl that live near it and absolutely adore it. They respond very well to disking, in fact. So if you're disking in the wetlands, you get a lot of this that comes up, and it is not at all bad for you. It is an annual grass, and the seed head on this guy actually changes from green to gray over time, or green to red. It kind of depends. But yeah, this is Sprangletop. So this here is summer grape. It's Vitis aestivalis. It is a native plant. It is a native woody vine, in fact, and it actually has a pretty high wildlife value, but I'll get to that in a minute. Unlike muscadine, which I also had in the same week, this has this very, and it's young now, so it doesn't have as much of it as it will, but it has this pubescence, this red pubescence on the leaves that doesn't show up on muscadine grape. It also has this red coloration to the vine that is incredibly bright, especially compared to muscadine. Probably the most obvious thing at first glance is that summer grape can have this really elaborate lobing on its thing, and it's rather impressive. But as to wildlife value, it has pretty decent wildlife value. It's eaten by a whole lot of animals. If birds can eat it, they will, but it's primarily mammals of varying sizes. The seeds are obviously dispersed by animals, them being grapes, but they do require scarification through the gut before they actually end up being able to sprout. So, one notable thing is that this striped skunk actually eats this, if it can. And, yeah, that fruit's available from August to October.